meaning that this act of disobedience serves the public good better than any alternative, there's no moral reason to act obediently. And therefore, an act utilitarian obligation to obey the law is specific, and it only applies to acts of obedience which are optimific, and it's certainly not absolute or generic. Lastly, in regard to rule utility, the rule utilitarian argument for an absolute obligation to obey the law is founded on the notion that anarchy will ensue if this absolute obligation doesn't exist. However, I contend that an absolute obligation to obey the law exists on top of the threat of sanction and on top of moral and societal guidelines that really dictate how we behave. An example here would be buying alcohol. My parents always told me, don't buy alcohol illegally. It's, you're underage. It's not okay. So that was my absolute obligation to obey that law. Now, recently, as I've gotten older, they've kind of said, we really don't care. So in essence, my absolute obligation to obey the law has disappeared. However, one of my friends went out to buy alcohol and he got busted and he got sanctioned. And therefore, my friends and I haven't tried to go out and buy alcohol because we're afraid of the sanction. So even though my absolute obligation to obey the law has disappeared, there's still no anarchy because the sanctions are deterring us from acting in this way. So in closing, the absolute obligation to obey the law is not necessary to maintaining orders in society, and it only promotes undue gratitude, unfairness, and really inefficient behavior. Thank you.
My name is Christina Zuniga, and I follow my partner Evan's opposition to the claim that there's an absolute obligation to obey the law by defending the common justifications for the merits of civil disobedience, defined as a public, nonviolent, conscientious, yet political act contrary to law, usually done with the aim of bringing about a change. In so proving that civil disobedience is both acceptable and sometimes necessary, it will then follow that there's not an absolute obligation to obey the law. Most obviously, justification for civil disobedience lies in the very fact that not all laws are just laws. So do we have an obligation to follow all laws without exception, even those that are unjust? Some would argue that we do. But if such a stance was upheld, we would clearly still be living in an unequal and prejudicial society where buses are segregated based on the color of your skin. As time passes, our conception of what's just changes, continually developing with the modern times. Citizens, mainly minorities in a society, observe injustices in the law, and it is then the government's responsibility to hear these concerns and adapt the law to fit society's basic moral standards. However, having these concerns heard and actually taken into account is often easier said than done. Responsibility then shifts, as Martin Luther King Jr. would argue, onto citizens to perform whatever acts necessary, including breaking the law, to force authorities to reevaluate the laws one perceives as unjust. Thus, it is often the case that in order to ensure these concerns are duly noted, the unjust laws be broken as a call to action. In the case of Rosa Parks, a revered historical figure whose act of civil disobedience was performed 55 years ago yesterday, would we have suggested she continue to sit in the back of the bus and wait to submit some sort of petition or complaint to the city's political leaders? You know as well as I that such efforts would prove to be futile, given a society where the majority and those in power were themselves prejudiced, which was reflected in unjust laws. A petition of the sort would quickly have been overlooked, so more attention-grabbing efforts were the sole way to spark reevaluation. Civil disobedience seeks to create such a crisis and foster attention that a community is forced to confront the issue, rather than just follow laws blindly. Now, certain stipulations on civil disobedience, such as those outlined by John Rawls, make it the case that it in no way endorses breaking any and all laws we consider unfit. Essentially, there are instrumental reasons to obey the government, and certain conditions must be met when disobeying the law, if the effort is to effectively evoke change. However, civil disobedience points to the limits of the majority principles by empowering all citizens to take action against injustice, whether it be regarding basic liberties or equal opportunities. The fact to be addressed here is that the imperfect character of justice places a citizen in a moral predicament. A citizen faces both an obligation to obey laws endorsed by an agreed-upon legal order and a duty to go against laws which he deems unjust to protect basic liberties. Along with these conflicting notions of obligations, we reach a middle ground that obligation to obey in a liberal society is relative as opposed to absolute. Here's where civil disobedience steps in as a means for the citizen to resolve his predicament. It compromises between the beliefs of the citizen and the regulation of the state by permitting the citizen to disobey an unjust law, but only under the conditions that uphold the constitutional order. As a result, civil disobedience tests and modifies the moral basis of a government and its laws. Comparing it to the legal system of the United States, disobedience plays the role of a sort of extension of the checks and balances system, which incorporates the citizens who, by acting through means of civil disobedience, question the constitutionality and fairness of certain laws. In all, I make the claim that civil disobedience is important, both as an outlet for societal concerns and as a means for checking the moral legitimacy of laws, demonstrates that obedience to the law is not absolute, it is relative, and breaking the laws can, at times, not only be permissible, but also beneficial to society as a whole.
Is this good? Okay. So I'm going to address the points that Evan made in support of not having an obligation to obey the law. First, he mentioned the idea of gratitude, stating that an even obligation to obey based on an uneven debt of gratitude is inherently unfair. This argument suggests that obligation to obey could be prorated to how much you get from the government, so that if you get more money from your Social Security check, you're required to obey more laws, or if you get less money, you don't have to obey certain laws as well. I think we can all agree that this is a system that's not necessarily going to work very well. So then the alternative is to say that no one has any obligation to obey the law in any situation, which will lead to anarchy. The second thing he brings up is the idea of fairness, which is that an obligation to obey the law is not going to be an issue if there is no impact on the public good. While this moves away from the idea of fairness a little bit, the idea of obeying the law in the stoplight example doesn't have to do with the amount of harm done to society by the person running the red light. It's the amount of harm done to society by the blatant disregard for the law, regardless of whether there is harm in the actual instance. It breeds ideas about the amount of harm done and things being okay as long as they are generally fair. The third thing Evan brought up was act utility, and said that a utilitarian obligation to obey the law is specific, only applying to acts of obedience which are optimific, and is not absolute or generic. I would contend that this supposes that people will be able to treat each law in isolation as opposed to as a part of a legal system. This is about whether there's a general obligation to obey the law. People will extrapolate, if they don't have to obey a certain law, that they don't necessarily have to obey other laws if it is beneficial for him as well. While it is true that specific laws can be unjust and therefore should be changed, this ignores the harm to the legal system as a whole, and therefore society in general, as a result of the disregard for the law. The final thing that Evan brought up was rule utility, saying that unfavorable acts of disobedience could be prevented by other means, such as sanctions and moral obligation. While this might be true, sanctions for things different, and different people have differing moral obligations. It's important to note that many of the things are encompassed within the legal system. If you're talking about sanctions, it's hard to imagine a system where you have a place to distribute justice without a legal system. Finally, different people are going to have different ideas about what is moral and what is not. And this is something that you need a law to be able to sort of spread the idea of morals to a general group. Finally, the opposition is going to make you want to think that it is possible to pick and choose within the legal system, when in fact the legal system itself is enormously complex. Yes, there are parts that are imperfect, but it is impossible to break these from the outside without shattering the entire system. Thank you so much.
Good to be refuting Kathleen's arguments. Firstly, it's granted that a legal system is fundamental to any civilized society. However, we must not overlook the importance of moral guidelines beyond our legal system. I contend that before the codification of laws in the Napoleonic era, anarchy didn't necessarily reign. Systems such as chivalry, honor, and religion maintained relative order in society. Nonetheless, I think the crux of this argument is clearly not whether a legal system should exist, but the importance of an absolute obligation to obey within such a system. So, contrary to the point made by our opposition, I reiterate my argument that devoid of an absolute obligation to obey the law, there are still many incentives to obey, which are in fact stronger than the idea of an absolute obligation. For one, many laws support ideas which are common sense, which is the reason they're laws in the first place. One does not need to feel this nebulous existential obligation to obey the law to know that running around naked in public is ill-advised. Social code